At the wedding, he was thin, quiet, in love. She smiled beside him, but was already comparing him to another man. Day after day, she told him he wasn't enough. Not strong enough, not muscular enough, not like her ex. She wanted everyone to see he was better than her ex, more fit, more handsome. She wanted to show off an upgrade. By the time his body started changing, it wasn't about love anymore. It was about desperation. And when she finally walked away, she left behind a man who had already crossed a line he could never come back from. This is the story of manipulation, veterinary drugs, and 13 bullet wounds. The question isn't just who pulled the trigger, it's who loaded the gun. Welcome to True Crime Story HQ. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe. On a quiet evening in September, a fatal choice was made inside a suburban home that would leave one person dead and another facing life in prison. 13 gunshots rang out in rapid succession. A woman collapsed on her living room floor, her blood pooling across the carpet while the man who killed her sat frozen on the couch, staring at what he'd just done. But who was the attacker and who was the victim? Before we answer that question, we need to go back to where it all started, a wedding that everyone knew was doomed from the beginning. Mark Sanderson was 32 years old when he decided to marry Natasha Peters. He worked as an IT technician for a mid-sized company, pulling in around $3,200 a month fixing network issues and troubleshooting computer problems. He wasn't rich, but he was stable. He owned a small house in a quiet neighborhood, drove a reliable car, and had decent credit. On paper, Mark was the kind of man most people would consider a safe bet. Predictable, responsible, financially secure. But Mark had one major flaw that would ultimately destroy him. He was desperate for validation. He needed to feel wanted, needed to feel like he mattered to someone. And there was something else, something Mark had never told anyone. Not his friends, not his family, not even his doctor beyond the initial diagnosis. Mark had a low sperm count. The diagnosis had come years earlier during a routine physical, when Mark mentioned concerns about fertility. The doctor had been blunt. Natural conception would be extremely difficult, possibly impossible. Mark carried that knowledge like a weight. He'd always wanted a family, always imagined having children, but the reality was that fathering biological children might never happen for him. Mark met Natasha Peters at a grocery store on a Tuesday evening in March. It wasn't romantic or planned, just two people reaching for the same brand of coffee on a shelf. They laughed about it, made small talk, and Natasha mentioned she was shopping for her 3 kids who went through groceries faster than she could buy them. Mark noticed she wasn't wearing a wedding ring. He asked if she'd like to grab coffee sometime. Natasha hesitated, then said yes. Their first real conversation happened 3 days later at a cafe downtown. Natasha was honest about her situation from the beginning. She'd just finalized a divorce from her ex-husband Collins Jenkins. She was working as a retail manager, barely making enough to support herself and 3 children. She was tired, overwhelmed, and didn't know how she was going to make everything work. Mark listened. He didn't judge. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just listened. And for the first time in months, Natasha felt like someone actually cared about what she was going through. Natasha was 29 years old, attractive in a girl-next-door way, with brown hair and tired eyes that told the story of someone who'd been through too much too fast. She had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, ages 7, 9, and 11. She told Mark that her ex-husband Collins was a construction worker who couldn't keep steady work, who'd left her struggling to pay bills while he drank and disappeared for days. She painted a picture of a man who was unreliable, who didn't care about his family, who'd abandoned them emotionally long before the divorce papers were filed. Mark believed every word. He saw a woman who'd been let down, who needed support, who deserved better. But it wasn't just pity that drew Mark to Natasha. There was genuine attraction. Natasha was funny when she wanted to be. She had moments of warmth that made Mark feel like he mattered. She listened when he talked about his job, his house, his life. She seemed interested in him as a person, not just as someone who could help her. And then there was the practical reality that Mark couldn't ignore. Natasha already had 3 children. The family Mark had always wanted already existed. He just had to step into it. His low sperm count, the thing that had made him feel defective for years, suddenly didn't matter. He didn't have to tell Natasha about his fertility issues. He didn't have to explain why he might never give her biological children. The children were already there. The problem was solved. Mark could be a father without the medical complications he'd been dreading. It felt like fate. Like the universe had put Natasha in his path for a reason. Mark started spending more time with Natasha and her kids. He'd take them to the park, buy them ice cream, help with homework. The children seemed to warm up to him. Natasha seemed grateful. Mark felt useful, needed, important. For the first time in his adult life, Mark felt like he was building something real. But there was another reason Mark felt pressure to move quickly with this relationship. His grandmother, the woman who'd raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12, was dying. She had stage 4 cancer and doctors had given her 6 months at most. Mark's grandmother had one wish she talked about constantly. She wanted to see Mark married before she died. She wanted to know he wouldn't be alone. She wanted to attend his wedding, see him happy, know that he'd found someone to build a life with. Every time Mark visited her in the hospital, she'd ask the same question. "Have you found someone yet?" Mark hated disappointing her. He hated telling her no, not yet, maybe someday. When Mark met Natasha, he saw an opportunity. He could give his grandmother the gift she wanted most. He could show her that he'd found love, that he'd be okay, that she could rest knowing he wasn't alone anymore. Mark proposed to Natasha after dating for 4 months. It was fast, too fast, and Mark knew it. But his grandmother was declining rapidly. The doctors had revised their timeline. She had weeks left, maybe a month. Mark needed to get married now, or his grandmother would never see it happen. When Mark proposed, Natasha said yes. She seemed happy, or at least Mark thought she did. They planned a small wedding within 3 weeks. Mark's grandmother attended despite being in a wheelchair, hooked up to oxygen, barely strong enough to sit upright. But she was there. She watched Mark say his vows. She cried tears of joy. 2 weeks after the wedding, she passed away peacefully. Mark was devastated by her death, but he held on to the fact that her final wish had been granted. She'd seen him married. She'd seen him happy. Or so he thought. Mark's friends saw the red flags immediately. They pulled him aside weeks before the wedding and told him not to go through with it. They said Natasha wasn't ready for another relationship. They said she seemed emotionally distant, that her conversations with Mark were shallow and surface level. But one friend in particular was more vocal than the rest. His name was Devin Hughes, and he'd known Mark since college. Devin and Mark had been roommates for 3 years at a small state university. They'd stayed close after graduation, grabbing beers every few weeks, helping each other move apartments, being there for each other during breakups and job changes. Devin was the kind of friend who told you the truth even when you didn't want to hear it. He was blunt, sometimes too blunt, but his loyalty was unquestionable. When Mark first told Devin about Natasha, Devin had been cautiously supportive. But as the relationship progressed, Devin's concerns grew. Devin met Natasha twice before the wedding. The first time was at a casual dinner Mark had organized to introduce Natasha to his closest friends. Devin watched Natasha throughout the evening and noticed things that bothered him. She barely looked at Mark. She spent most of dinner on her phone, texting someone, scrolling through social media. When Mark tried to include her in conversations, she'd give short answers and then go back to her phone. Devin also noticed how Natasha talked about her ex-husband. She mentioned Collins multiple times during dinner, always negatively, but with a strange energy that Devin couldn't quite place. It wasn't the way someone talked about an ex they'd moved on from. It was the way someone talked about an ex they were still emotionally invested in. After dinner, Devin pulled Mark aside and said, "Man, I don't know about this. She doesn't seem into you." Mark laughed it off. She's just nervous meeting everyone. Give her time. The second time Devin met Natasha was at Mark's house about 2 weeks before the wedding. Mark had invited a few friends over to help with wedding preparations. Devin arrived early and found Natasha sitting on the couch, looking frustrated. Mark was in the kitchen making sandwiches. Devin tried to make conversation with Natasha, asking about the wedding plans, about her kids, about how she was feeling. Natasha's responses were polite but distant. Then her phone rang. She looked at the caller ID and her entire demeanor changed. She stood up quickly and walked outside to take the call. Devin watched through the window as Natasha paced back and forth in the driveway, animated, smiling, laughing. She was on the phone for 20 minutes. When she came back inside, Mark asked who called. Natasha said it was just her sister. But Devin noticed she'd saved the contact under a woman's name. He didn't say anything at the time, but the interaction stuck with him. 3 days before the wedding, Devin made one final attempt to stop Mark from making what he believed was a terrible mistake. He invited Mark to lunch at a diner they'd been going to since their college days. Devin didn't ease into the conversation. He went straight to the point. "Mark, I love you like a brother, you know that, but I'm begging you not to marry this woman." Mark's face hardened. "Devin, don't start. I've made my decision." Devin leaned forward. "Have you? Or did your dying grandmother make the decision for you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're rushing into this marriage because you want to give your grandmother peace before she dies. That's not a good enough reason to marry someone." Mark felt anger rising. "You don't know what you're talking about. I love Natasha. She loves me. We're building a family together." Devin shook his head. "She doesn't love you, man. I've watched her with you. She barely looks at you. She's on her phone constantly. She talks about her ex like she's still thinking about him. And you know what I think? I think she's still in contact with him." Mark stood up from the table. "You're out of line." Devin stood up too. "Maybe, but I'd rather be out of line than watch my best friend marry someone who's using him. That's what this is, Mark. She's using you. You have a house. You have a stable job. You're willing to take care of her kids. She's not marrying you because she loves you. She's marrying you because you're convenient." The words hit Mark harder than he wanted to admit, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "I don't need your approval, Devin. I'm getting married with or without your blessing." Devin's expression softened. "I'm not asking you to get my approval. I'm asking you to wait. Just wait a few more months. Get to know her better. Let your grandmother pass, in peace, and then make the decision with a clear head. If you still want to marry her after that, fine, I'll shut up. But please don't rush this." Mark grabbed his jacket. "I can't wait. My grandmother is dying. I need to do this now." Devin watched his best friend walk out of the diner, knowing he'd just lost a battle he desperately wanted to win. Devin attended the wedding because Mark was his friend and he wanted to support him, even if he disagreed with the decision. He sat in the back row, watching the ceremony with a heavy heart. He saw Mark say his vows with genuine emotion. He saw Natasha say her vows with a distant smile. He saw Mark's grandmother crying tears of joy in her wheelchair, believing her grandson had found happiness. And Devin felt a deep sense of dread. He knew this marriage was going to fail. He just didn't know how bad it would get. After the ceremony, Devin approached Mark and hugged him. "I hope I'm wrong," Devin said. "I really do." Mark hugged him back. "You are wrong, but I appreciate you caring enough to say something." That was the last real conversation they had for months. Devin tried to stay in touch, but Mark became distant. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages got short replies. Devin understood what was happening. Natasha was isolating Mark from his friends, and there was nothing Devin could do about it, except wait and hope Mark would reach out if things went bad. The wedding happened on a Saturday afternoon in late summer. The venue was a small community center, decorated with simple white flowers and folding chairs. Mark's grandmother sat in the front row, weak but smiling, oxygen tank beside her. Natasha wore a white dress that she'd bought on sale from the retail store where she worked. Mark wore a suit that was slightly too big for his thin frame. The ceremony was short, maybe 20 minutes. A local officiant read standard vows. Mark said "I do" with genuine emotion in his voice. He meant every word. He was committing his life to this woman, to her children, to building a family together. When it was Natasha's turn, she said "I do" with a smile on her face. But the people who knew Mark well noticed something. Natasha's eyes were distant. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She went through the motions, but there was no depth behind them. They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that Mark had purchased with money from his savings account. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Mark leaned in to kiss Natasha. She kissed him back, briefly, then pulled away and turned to face the small crowd of family and friends who'd attended. Everyone applauded. Mark's grandmother was crying happy tears, holding a tissue to her face, overwhelmed with emotion that her grandson had finally found someone. Mark looked at Natasha, expecting to see joy or excitement, or at least some acknowledgement of the moment they'd just shared. But Natasha was already looking away. Mark told himself it was nerves. He told himself it was the stress of the day. He told himself everything would be fine once they were alone together. The ceremony ended. Guests stood and began making their way to the reception area in an adjacent room. Mark took Natasha's hand and she let him hold it, but there was no warmth in her grip. Just compliance. Mark's grandmother wheeled herself over to congratulate them. She hugged Mark and whispered, "I'm so proud of you. I'm so happy you found her." Mark hugged his grandmother back, fighting tears, grateful that she'd lived to see this day. 2 weeks later, she'd be gone. But in that moment, Mark felt like he'd done something right. He'd given her peace. He'd shown her he wouldn't be alone. He'd made her final days a little bit happier. What Mark didn't know was that this wedding, this marriage, this choice, it would cost him everything. Before you go any further, do us a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Your support keeps this channel going, and it means everything. Now let's continue. With the wedding over, Mark could focus on building a real life with Natasha and her 3 children. When they walked through the front door, Natasha's kids were already there, having been dropped off earlier by Collins after their weekend visit. The children ran to their mother, excited about the wedding, asking about the cake and the music. Natasha smiled at them, genuinely warm in a way Mark rarely saw her be with him. Mark stood in the doorway watching this moment, thinking maybe this was what family was supposed to look like. Maybe everything would work out after all. The first week of marriage was relatively normal. Mark went to work every day, came home, helped with dinner, tried to connect with the kids. Natasha seemed tired most of the time, which Mark understood. She was working full-time as a retail manager, dealing with 3 children, adjusting to married life. Mark gave her space when she needed it. He didn't push for intimacy or deep conversations. He told himself they had time to build that connection. The kids were polite to Mark, calling him by his first name, not Dad, but not hostile either. Mark would help the oldest daughter with her math homework. He'd play video games with the son. He'd read bedtime stories to the youngest. It felt like progress, like he was slowly becoming part of this family. Natasha watched these interactions without much comment. She didn't praise Mark for his efforts, but she didn't criticize him either. She was just there, present, but distant. By the second week, Mark started noticing small things. Natasha would sleep facing away from him every night. When he'd try to hold her, she'd shift position and create distance. When he'd ask about her day, she'd give one-word answers. Fine. Busy. Tired. Mark tried not to read too much into it. He'd been single for years, before meeting Natasha. Maybe this was just how married life worked. Maybe the Hollywood version of romance he'd imagined wasn't realistic. Maybe he needed to be patient and let things develop naturally. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind that something was off. Natasha never initiated conversation. She never asked him questions about his work or his interests. She never suggested they do things together. It was like Mark was living with a roommate, not a wife. 3 weeks into the marriage, the first real comment came. Mark was getting dressed for work one morning when Natasha walked past the bedroom and glanced at him. She stopped, looked at his bare torso and said, "You're really skinny, you know that?" Mark laughed it off, thinking she was just making an observation. "Yeah, I've always been thin. Fast metabolism, I guess." Natasha didn't smile. She just said, "You should probably do something about that," and walked away. The comment stung more than Mark wanted to admit. He looked at himself in the mirror after she left. He'd never been particularly muscular, but he'd never thought of himself as problematic either. He was just average, normal. But Natasha's tone suggested that normal wasn't good enough. Mark pushed the thought aside and went to work. But the comment stayed with him all day. A few days later, another comment came. The family was eating dinner together, spaghetti that Mark had cooked. Natasha's son asked Mark if he'd ever played football. Mark said no, he'd never been into sports. The boy said, "Oh, my dad played football in high school. He was really good." Mark smiled and said, "That's cool." Natasha chimed in without looking up from her plate. "Collins was always athletic. He's got that build for it." Mark felt his stomach tighten. Why was she bringing up Collins? What did that have to do with anything? But Mark didn't say anything. He just kept eating. The rest of dinner was quiet. Mark helped clean up, got the kids ready for bed, and tried to shake the feeling that Natasha had been making a comparison. Maybe he was being paranoid. Maybe she was just stating a fact about her ex-husband. But the way she said it felt intentional, like she wanted Mark to know that Collins had something Mark didn't. By the end of the first month, the comments were coming more frequently. "Collins used to help with yard work. Can you handle that?" "My ex never had trouble opening jars. Are your arms really that weak? Do you ever work out? You look like you've never lifted anything heavy in your life." Each comment was small on its own, easy to dismiss as a joke or an innocent observation, but together they formed a pattern. Natasha was comparing Mark to Collins, and Mark was losing every comparison. Mark tried to laugh it off at first. He'd make self-deprecating jokes, trying to show that he wasn't bothered. But he was bothered. Every comment chipped away at his confidence. He started noticing his own body in ways he never had before. His thin arms, his lack of muscle definition, his average build that suddenly felt inadequate. Mark started Googling fitness advice late at night when Natasha was asleep. How to build muscle for beginners. Best home workouts for skinny guys. How long does it take to get in shape? He watched videos of fitness influencers explaining workout routines and diet plans. He read articles about protein intake and progressive overload. Mark convinced himself that if he just put in the effort, if he just started working out, Natasha would stop making comments. She'd see that he was trying. She'd appreciate the effort. Things would get better. But there was a problem. Mark's income was already stretched thin. Natasha's 3 children needed school supplies, new clothes, sports equipment. Natasha herself spent money on things she wanted. Makeup, new outfits, dinners with coworkers. Mark paid the mortgage, utilities, groceries, car insurance. By the end of each month, he had maybe $200 left. A gym membership would cost $60 or $70 a month. Protein supplements would cost another $50 or $60. Mark didn't have that kind of disposable income. He was trapped. 2 months into the marriage, Natasha's comments became more direct and cruel. "Why are you so skinny? It's actually embarrassing." Collins had muscles. Real muscles. "You look like you've never worked a day in your life. I can't even feel your arms when you hug me. There's nothing there." The comments came multiple times a day now. Morning, afternoon, evening. Unprovoked. Mark could be sitting on the couch watching TV, and Natasha would walk by and drop a comment about his body. He could be making dinner, and she'd mention how Collins used to lift heavy pots with ease while Mark struggled. The psychological assault was constant. Mark's self-esteem, which had never been particularly strong to begin with, completely collapsed. He stopped looking at himself in mirrors. He started wearing baggy clothes to hide his frame. He stopped eating properly because he thought losing fat would make him look more toned. His mental health deteriorated rapidly. The breaking point came 3 months into the marriage. Natasha called Mark into the living room one evening. She had her phone in her hand and a strange expression on her face. "I want to show you something," she said. Mark sat down next to her, assuming she was going to show him a funny video or a news article. Instead, Natasha pulled up a photo. It was Collins, shirtless, standing in a backyard. The photo was from a few years ago based on the timestamp. Collins' body was on full display. Defined abs, thick arms, broad chest, powerful shoulders. He looked like someone who'd been lifting weights his entire life. Natasha held the phone directly in front of Mark's face. "This is what a man should look like," she said. Her voice was cold and matter-of-fact. "I need you to look better than this. I need everyone to see you're better than him." Mark stared at the photo. His hands started shaking. His heart was pounding. He felt rage building inside him, but he couldn't articulate it. He couldn't defend himself. He just sat there, frozen, staring at the image of a man he could never be. Natasha sent the photo to Mark's phone. "Keep that," she said. "Look at it whenever you need motivation." Then she stood up and walked away, leaving Mark sitting alone on the couch, holding his phone, staring at Colin's muscular body. Mark felt something break inside him in that moment. This wasn't about health. This wasn't about motivation. Natasha wanted him to look like Collins. She wanted to show Collins that she'd upgraded. She wanted Mark to be her trophy, proof that leaving Collins was the right decision. But Mark didn't look like Collins. He never would, and Natasha was making sure he knew it. That night, after Natasha went to bed, Mark spent hours online searching for solutions. He couldn't afford a gym. He couldn't afford supplements. He couldn't afford a personal trainer. But he needed to do something. The comparisons were destroying him. The daily comments were unbearable. Mark felt like he was drowning in inadequacy. He went deeper into fitness forums, clicking through threads, reading posts from people in similar situations. Most of the advice was useless. But then Mark found a thread titled, "Budget Muscle Building: What Works When You're Broke." He clicked on it. The post explained that veterinary products could create the appearance of muscle growth. It mentioned something called ADE complex. Mark had never heard of it, but he kept reading. The post included before and after photos showing significant size increase in arms and shoulders. It admitted the growth wasn't real muscle, just swelling and inflammation. But from a distance it looked convincing. And it cost only $25. Mark spent the next 2 hours researching ADE complex. He learned it was a veterinary vitamin ADE injectable complex designed for livestock. When injected into humans, it caused tissue inflammation that created the illusion of size. It wasn't FDA approved for human use. The risks included hypervitaminosis, tissue necrosis, permanent disfigurement. Mark read horror stories from people whose bodies were ruined. But he also read about the cost. $25. No prescription needed. No questions asked. Mark looked at the photo Natasha had sent him. Collins's perfect body. The body Natasha wanted Mark to have. The body Mark would never achieve naturally, especially not with his financial situation. Mark made a decision. He was going to try the ADE injections. He didn't care about the risks. He didn't care about the consequences. He just wanted Natasha to stop comparing him to Collins. He wanted to feel like he was enough. He wanted to save his marriage. Mark didn't realize he was about to destroy himself in the process. Mark drove 30 minutes outside the city to a rural area where farms and ranches dotted the landscape. He'd found the location online, a veterinary supply store that sold everything from horse feed to cattle medication. The store was in a strip mall next to a feed supply warehouse and a tractor repair shop. It looked run down, with faded paint on the walls and a flickering neon sign that read, "Vet Supplies." Mark parked his car and sat there for a few minutes, staring at the entrance. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. Part of him knew this was a terrible idea. Part of him knew he should turn around, drive home, and forget this whole thing. But the other part of him, the the part that had been destroyed by months of psychological abuse, was stronger. He got out of the car and walked inside. The store smelled like hay and animal feed. There were bags of dog food stacked along the walls, shelves full of flea medication and deworming pills, and a counter where a middle-aged woman stood sorting through receipts. Mark walked up to the counter, trying to look casual, trying not to seem suspicious. The woman looked up and asked, "Help you find something?" Mark cleared his throat and said, "Yeah, I need ADE complex." The woman didn't even blink. She just nodded and said, "Injectable or oral?" Mark hadn't thought about that. He stammered for a second before saying, "Injectable." The woman turned around and went to the back room. Mark stood there, heart pounding, wondering if she was going to ask why he needed it, if she was going to question what kind of animals he owned, if she was going to realize he had no business buying veterinary products. But she didn't ask anything. She came back a minute later holding a small glass bottle with a rubber stopper on top. The label read, "Veterinary Vitamin ADE Complex, for animal use only." She set it on the counter and said, "That'll be $25. Mark handed her cash. She gave him a receipt and said, "Have a good day." That was it. No questions, no verification, no warning. Mark walked out with the bottle in his hand, feeling both relieved and terrified. Mark had ordered syringes online a few days earlier. They'd arrived in a plain cardboard box with no branding, no indication of what was inside. He'd hidden them in the back of his closet where Natasha wouldn't find them. That night, after Natasha went to bed, Mark locked himself in the bathroom. He set the bottle of ADE on the counter next to the box of syringes. His hands were shaking as he opened the box and pulled out a syringe. The needle looked longer than he expected. Thicker. More intimidating. Mark had never injected himself with anything before. He'd never even given blood without feeling queasy. But he was committed now. He couldn't turn back. He opened the bottle and inserted the needle through the rubber stopper. The liquid inside was thick and yellowish, moving slowly like cooking oil. Mark pulled back the plunger and watched the syringe. Fill. 1 milliliter. 2 milliliters. 3 milliliters. He wasn't sure how much to use. The forums had given conflicting advice. Some people said 1 milliliter per injection site. Others said 3 or 4. Mark decided to start small. He pulled the syringe out and set the bottle aside. Mark wiped his right bicep with an alcohol pad, trying to remember the injection technique he'd read about online. The forum said to inject into the belly of the muscle, not too deep, not too shallow. Mark positioned the needle against his skin. He took a deep breath. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the syringe. He thought about Natasha. He thought about Collins. He thought about all the times he'd been told he wasn't enough. He pushed the needle in. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. It felt like a knife cutting through his skin and into his muscle tissue. Mark clenched his teeth to keep from screaming. He pushed the plunger down slowly, forcing the thick liquid into his bicep. He could feel it spreading under his skin, burning, tearing, creating pressure that made his arm throb. He pulled the needle out and blood dripped down his arm. He wiped it away with a towel and stared at the injection site. There was a small red mark, slightly swollen, already starting to bruise. Mark looked at himself in the mirror. His face was pale. Sweat was dripping down his forehead. His arm was on fire, but he told himself it would be worth it. He told himself, "This will save my marriage. She'll finally be proud of me." Mark kept injecting himself 2 to 3 times a week for the next 6 weeks. He rotated injection sites to avoid damaging any single area too badly. Biceps, shoulders, chest, back, anywhere he thought would add visible size. Each injection brought the same intense pain, the same burning sensation, the same fear that he was making a terrible mistake. But Mark kept going. He convinced himself that the pain was temporary, that the results would justify the suffering. Slowly, his body began to change, but not in the way he'd hoped. The areas where he injected started to swell significantly. His biceps looked bigger, but they were uneven. One was noticeably larger than the other, because Mark had injected slightly more on that side. His shoulders became lumpy and distorted, with strange bulges that didn't look like natural muscle. His chest looked inflamed, like he was having an allergic reaction. The swelling wasn't uniform. It wasn't symmetrical. It didn't look like he'd been working out. It looked like something was seriously wrong with his body. Mark's skin began to change color around the injection sites. Dark patches appeared, purplish bruises that never fully healed, yellowish discoloration from the oil-based suspension pooling under his skin. The areas felt hard to the touch, like scar tissue was forming deep in his muscle. When Mark pressed on his bicep, it didn't feel like muscle. It felt like a firm, unyielding mass that didn't belong there. His mobility started decreasing. Lifting his arms above his head became painful and difficult. Turning his torso felt stiff and restricted. Simple movements that he'd never thought about before, reaching for something on a high shelf, putting on a shirt, stretching in the morning, all became uncomfortable or impossible. Mark was in constant pain. His body was failing, and the worst part was that he didn't look better. He looked worse, much worse. Natasha noticed the changes almost immediately. At first, she didn't say anything. She just stared at Mark with a confused, almost disgusted expression when he walked by. By the second week, she started asking questions. "What's wrong with your arms? Why do you look like that? What did you do?" Mark tried to explain. He told her he'd been working out. He told her he was taking supplements. He tried to convince her that his body was transforming, that he was becoming the man she wanted him to be. But Natasha wasn't buying it. She could see that something was seriously wrong. She could see that Mark's body didn't look muscular. It looked deformed. By the third week, her confusion had turned into full-blown disgust. She looked at Mark one morning while he was getting dressed and said, "What did you do to yourself? This isn't what I meant." Mark froze. He didn't know what to say. He thought she would be happy. He thought she would see the size and think he looked stronger. But she didn't. She looked at him like he was a freak. She looked at him like he'd ruined himself. The swelling continued to get worse over the following weeks. Mark's appearance became increasingly distorted with each injection. His arms looked bulky but misshapen, like someone had stuffed balloons under his skin. His shoulders looked like they belonged to two completely different people. One was significantly larger than the other, creating an asymmetrical, grotesque appearance. His chest was uneven, with one side protruding more than the other, in a way that made him look disfigured. He didn't look muscular. He didn't look strong. He looked like someone who'd injected themselves with something they shouldn't have. And that's exactly what he was. The pain never went away. It became a constant, throbbing presence in his life. Mark couldn't sleep on his side anymore because the pressure on his arms and shoulders was too intense. He couldn't wear tight shirts because the fabric irritated his inflamed skin. He couldn't hug anyone, not that Natasha wanted to hug him anyway, because physical contact caused sharp shooting pain. His body was destroying itself from the inside out. And Natasha's disgust was growing with each passing day. One night, about 7 weeks after Mark started the injections, Natasha sat him down at the kitchen table. She had a serious look on her face, the kind of expression that meant something bad was about to happen. Mark's heart sank before she even said a word. Natasha looked at him and said, "I can't be with you. I'm ashamed to even be seen with you." Mark felt his world shattering. He'd destroyed his body for her. He'd spent weeks in agonizing pain, injecting himself with a dangerous veterinary substance, all because she told him he wasn't good enough. He'd risked his health, his appearance, his future, all to meet her impossible standards. And now she was leaving. She told him she was filing for divorce. She told him she'd already talked to a lawyer. She told him she wanted him out of the house within 30 days. Mark tried to protest. He tried to explain that he'd done all of this for her, that he'd changed himself because she demanded it. But Natasha didn't care. She said, "I never forced you to do anything. You did this to yourself." And with that, she walked away. Within 48 hours, divorce papers appeared at the house. Natasha had moved quickly, eager to escape the marriage she should never have entered in the first place. She told her friends and family about what Mark had done to his body. She made him the villain in the story, the crazy person who'd ruined himself. She never mentioned the months of psychological abuse, the constant comparisons to Collins, the daily reminders that Mark wasn't enough. She painted herself as the victim who'd married a man who turned out to be unstable, and people believed her. Mark was left completely alone. He had no money. Every dollar he'd earned had gone to supporting Natasha and her children. He had no dignity. His body was permanently damaged, his appearance disfigured in a way that would mark him for the rest of his life. He had no hope. The one thing he'd sacrificed everything for, his marriage, was ending. The medical reality was undeniable. Mark didn't build muscle. He created a disaster. He injected oil-based veterinary vitamins into his body, causing inflammation, tissue damage, and permanent scarring. And Natasha, the woman who'd pushed him to this point, walked away without a second thought. But the story doesn't end there, because Mark was about to discover something that would push him past the point of no return. What Mark didn't know was that not everything Natasha told him was true. In fact, most of what she'd said about her past was a carefully constructed lie. Her so-called abusive ex-husband, Collins Jenkins, the man she claimed had hurt her physically and emotionally, the man she said she'd barely escaped from, none of that was real. Collins Jenkins never laid a hand on Natasha. He never threatened her. He never controlled her or terrorized her. The abuse claims were completely fabricated. Natasha had created an entire false narrative to justify leaving Collins and to manipulate Mark into feeling sorry for her. She'd played the victim so convincingly that Mark never questioned it. He believed every word because he wanted to be her hero. He wanted to save her from a terrible past. But there was nothing to save her from. The real reason Natasha left. Collins had nothing to do with violence or fear. It had everything to do with money. Collins worked in construction, which meant his income fluctuated wildly. Some months were good. Big projects, overtime opportunities, decent paychecks. Other months were brutal. Weather delays, canceled jobs, barely enough to cover rent. He lived paycheck to paycheck, struggling to keep the lights on and food in the fridge. Natasha watched this financial instability and made a decision. She couldn't build the life she wanted with a man who couldn't provide consistency. She wanted a house with a yard. She wanted new clothes and nice dinners and vacations. She wanted financial security. Collins couldn't give her any of that. So Natasha started looking for someone who could. When she met Mark at that grocery store, she saw exactly what she needed. A man with a steady job, a house, savings in the bank. Mark wasn't a romantic choice. He was a financial solution. And Natasha took full advantage of that. But here's what makes Natasha's betrayal even more devastating. She never actually left Collins. Not emotionally. Not romantically. Not even physically. The divorce was just paperwork. The separation was just a performance. Natasha and Collins never truly ended their relationship. Even while she was dating Mark, even while she was planning her wedding, even while she was saying her vows in front of Mark's dying grandmother, Natasha was still in contact with Collins. She'd text him late at night when Mark was asleep. She'd call him during her lunch breaks at work. She kept that connection alive because she knew Mark was temporary. Collins was the man she actually wanted. Mark was just the man who could pay the bills while Collins got his life together financially. The affair didn't start after the wedding. It never stopped. Natasha had been texting Collins within 1 week of marrying Mark. She hadn't even finished unpacking her belongings in Mark's house yet. The texts started innocently, asking about the kids, making small talk, checking in. But they quickly became more personal. Natasha complained to Collins about Mark. She told Collins that Mark was boring, that he wasn't what she expected, that the marriage felt like a mistake. Collins responded with sympathy and encouragement. He told Natasha he missed her. He told her he wished things had worked out differently between them. By week 3 of the marriage, Natasha and Collins met in person. They chose a coffee shop on the other side of town, where no one they knew would see them. They talked for 2 hours, sitting close, holding hands across the table, acting like a couple that had never broken up. During that coffee meeting, Collins told Natasha about a major change in his life. He'd gotten a promotion at his construction company. He'd been moved from general labor to a supervisor position. The promotion came with a substantial pay increase, $4,800 a month, consistent and stable with benefits and opportunities for advancement. The financial instability that drove Natasha away was gone. Collins could now afford everything Natasha had wanted from him in the first place. He had a nice apartment, disposable income, and financial security. Suddenly, Collins wasn't the broke construction worker anymore. He was financially viable. He was everything Natasha had been looking for when she married Mark. And Natasha saw an opportunity to get what she really wanted. By week 5 of her marriage to Mark, Natasha and Collins had their first intimate encounter at his new apartment. Natasha told Mark she was going out with friends from work. She told him not to wait up. Then she drove straight to Collins' place and spent the night. When she came home the next morning, Mark was making breakfast, completely oblivious. He asked how her night was. Natasha said it was fine, that she'd had fun, that she was tired. Mark kissed her forehead and handed her a cup of coffee. He had no idea his wife had just spent the night in another man's bed. The pattern was established immediately. Natasha would meet Collins twice a week, sometimes more. She'd go to his apartment after work. She'd meet him at motels during her lunch break. She'd tell Mark she was running errands or meeting friends. Mark believed her every single time. While Mark was at his office fixing computer problems and earning the money that paid for Natasha's lifestyle, she was with Collins. While Mark was taking care of Natasha's 3 children, helping with homework and making dinner, Natasha was having an affair with their biological father. The cruelty of this situation is almost incomprehensible. Mark was sacrificing everything, his money, his time, his dignity, to support a family that wasn't his. And the entire time, Natasha was betraying him with the man she'd claimed was abusive. The man Mark thought he was protecting her from. The man Natasha had never actually left. By week 10 of the marriage, Mark started his ADE injections. He was destroying his body to look like Collins. He was enduring excruciating pain because Natasha told him he needed to be more muscular. And during that entire time, Natasha was sleeping with Collins. The irony is too cruel to fully comprehend. Mark would inject himself with veterinary drugs, watch his body swell and distort, convince himself he was making progress, all while Natasha was in Collins' bed. She would come home from seeing Collins and find Mark in the bathroom, staring at his deformed arms in the mirror, believing he was getting closer to what Natasha wanted. She'd look at Mark's grotesque appearance and feel disgusted. Then she'd think about Collins's natural, muscular physique. The comparisons Natasha made weren't innocent. They weren't motivational. They were deliberate torture. Natasha knew exactly what she was doing. She was keeping Mark hooked with the false hope that if he just changed his body, she'd love him. But she never intended to love him. She just needed him to keep paying the bills. Natasha's motivation for pushing Mark to transform his body was strategic and cruel. On one level, she wanted to keep Mark working and paying for her lifestyle while she enjoyed her relationship with Collins. If Mark believed he could win her affection by changing his appearance, he'd keep trying. He'd keep sacrificing. He'd keep giving her everything she needed financially. Natasha could string him along indefinitely. On another level, Natasha wanted the option to show Collins that she had someone better. If Mark actually succeeded in building an impressive physique, she could parade him around and make Collins jealous. She could prove to everyone that leaving Collins and marrying Mark was an upgrade. It was a sick game she was playing with both men, using them for different purposes, caring about neither of them. But when Mark's body became deformed from the ADE injections, he lost all value to Natasha. He couldn't be shown off. He couldn't make Collins jealous. He just became an embarrassment. Collins, now financially stable and still maintaining his natural muscular build, became the obvious choice. There was no reason for Natasha to stay with Mark anymore. Collins could provide financial stability and physical attraction. Mark could provide nothing except horror and shame. By week 16 of the marriage, Natasha filed for divorce. She'd already made her decision. She was going back to Collins permanently. Mark had served his purpose. He'd provided temporary housing and financial support while Collins got his promotion and salary increase. Now that Collins could offer everything, Mark was disposable. Natasha walked away without guilt, without remorse, without a second thought about the man she'd destroyed. Mark received an anonymous text message 3 days before his divorce from Natasha was set to be finalized. The message was simple. "Your wife is seeing someone. Thought you should know." Mark stared at the text for a long time. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend he hadn't seen it, to just let the divorce happen and move on with his life. But another part of him needed to know the truth. He texted back, "Who is this?" The response came 30 seconds later. "A friend. Check your phone in 5 minutes." Mark waited. His hands were shaking. His heart was pounding. 5 minutes later, 3 photos appeared on his phone. The first photo showed Natasha and Collins sitting together at a restaurant, holding hands across the table. The second photo showed them in a parking lot, embracing, Collins's hand on the small of Natasha's back. The third photo showed them kissing outside what looked like an apartment building. The timestamp on the photos was from the previous evening. Mark felt something inside him go cold. Mark's reaction was eerily calm. There was no screaming, no crying, no throwing his phone across the room. He just sat there, staring at the photos, absorbing what they meant. Natasha had been cheating on him. With Collins. The same man she'd claimed was abusive. The same man she'd spent months comparing Mark to. The same man Mark had destroyed his body trying to look like. Mark felt detached from reality, like he was watching his life happen to someone else. He saved the photos to his phone and began investigating. He needed to know everything. He needed to know how long this had been going on. He needed to know if his entire marriage had been a lie. Mark started by checking their shared phone bill. He logged into the account online and pulled up 6 months of call and text records. What he found made his stomach turn. There were hundreds of calls and texts between Natasha's number and Collins' number. The contact had started 1 week after their wedding. The frequency increased steadily over the following months. Some days, Natasha and Collins exchanged 30 or 40 texts. They'd talk on the phone for an hour or more while Mark was at work. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Natasha had been in constant contact with Collins throughout their entire marriage. Mark felt sick. He'd been working, paying bills, supporting her children, trying to save their relationship, while she was talking to Collins every single day. Mark went out to Natasha's car while she was inside the house. He'd noticed she'd been keeping the car locked lately, which was unusual. He used his spare key to unlock it and started searching. Under the passenger seat, he found a stack of receipts. 3 motel receipts, all from different locations, all within the past 2 months. The dates matched days when Natasha had told Mark she was going out with friends. Mark took photos of the receipts with his phone. He locked the car and went back inside, his mind racing. He pulled up Natasha's social media profiles and started going through her location tags. She'd been tagging herself at restaurants, coffee shops, parks. Mark cross-referenced those locations with Collins's social media check-ins. They matched. Multiple times, Natasha had tagged herself at the exact same place Collins had checked in on the exact same day. She'd been seeing him in public, not even trying to hide it from anyone except Mark. Mark started asking around the neighborhood. He talked to neighbors, casual acquaintances, people who might have seen something. One neighbor, an elderly man who lived 2 houses down, gave Mark information that confirmed his worst fears. The man said he'd seen a truck matching Collins's description parked in front of Mark's house multiple times during work hours. He said he'd seen a man matching Collins's description entering the house when Mark's car wasn't in the driveway. The neighbor thought maybe it was a repairman or contractor. He didn't realize he was witnessing an affair. Mark thanked the neighbor and walked back to his house in a daze. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. The affair had started during week 1 of the marriage and had continued non-stop for months. Mark pieced together the complete timeline, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. She never left him. I was just a paycheck. Everything made sense now. The shallow conversations before the wedding, the emotional distance from day 1, the constant comparisons to Collins, the refusal to be intimate, the cruel comments about Mark's body. Natasha had never intended to be Mark's wife in any real sense. She'd needed a place to live and someone to pay bills while Collins got his life together financially. Mark was never her husband. He was her temporary solution. And now that Collins was financially stable, Mark was being discarded. Mark pulled up his bank statements and started adding numbers. Over the 6 months of marriage, he'd spent $47,000 on Natasha and her children. His credit cards were maxed out. His savings account was empty. His retirement fund had been drained. He'd destroyed his financial future for a woman who was using him from the very beginning. Mark confronted the reality of his situation. His credit was destroyed. His savings were depleted. His body was ruined. All for a woman who had never loved him, had never been faithful to him, had never intended to build a life with him. The comparisons to Collins hadn't been motivation. They'd been taunts. Natasha had been sleeping with Collins while telling Mark he needed to look more like Collins. She'd been meeting Collins twice a week while Mark injected himself with veterinary drugs. She'd watched Mark destroy his body and felt nothing but disgust. Natasha knew exactly what she was doing. Every cruel comment, every comparison, every rejection, it was all calculated. She'd played Mark perfectly, extracting everything she needed from him while giving nothing in return. Mark made a decision. He needed one final conversation with Natasha. He needed to hear the truth from her directly. He needed her to admit what she'd done. He texted Natasha and said he wanted to meet to discuss property division before the divorce was finalized. He suggested they meet at their house, the house Mark was still paying the mortgage on, the following evening. He said it would be easier to go through paperwork in person. Natasha agreed without hesitation. She thought it was just a routine divorce discussion. She thought Mark was being cooperative and reasonable. She assumed he'd accepted the end of their marriage and was ready to move forward. She had no idea that Mark knew about Collins. She had no idea what was building inside him. She had no idea what was coming. Natasha arranged for her 3 children to spend the night at Collins's mother's house. This was standard for her. Whenever she needed to handle adult business or wanted an evening to herself, she'd send the kids to their grandmother. The house would be empty, just Mark and Natasha. Natasha arrived at 7 in the evening, right on time. She walked through the front door like she owned the place, which technically she still did until the divorce was finalized. She was impatient and dismissive, clearly wanting to get this over with as quickly as possible. She sat down on the couch, crossed her arms, and said, "Let's make this quick. I have plans tonight." Mark knew what those plans were. She was going to see Collins after this. But she had no idea that Mark knew everything. She had no idea what was about to happen. Natasha sat on the couch in the living room, divorce papers spread out on the coffee table. She looked impatient, checking her phone every few seconds, clearly wanting this conversation to end. Mark sat in the chair across from her, unnervingly calm. There was something different about him that Natasha couldn't quite identify. His body language was relaxed. His voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes that should have warned her. Mark started the conversation with a direct question. When did it start with Collins? Natasha's head snapped up. She stopped looking at her phone. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Her tone was defensive, but Mark could see recognition in her eyes. She knew exactly what he was talking about. Mark pulled out his phone and showed her the photos. Natasha and Collins at the restaurant. Natasha and Collins in the parking lot. Natasha and Collins kissing. Natasha's face went pale, then red. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mark cut her off. "Tell me the truth," Mark said. His voice was quiet, but firm. "When did it start?" Natasha looked at the photos, then at Mark, then back at the photos. She seemed to be calculating her response, trying to figure out how much Mark knew, how much she could still deny. But something in Mark's expression told her that lying was pointless. He already knew. So Natasha made a choice that would seal her fate. She decided to tell him the truth, and she decided to tell him without an ounce of remorse. "It started a week after we got married," Natasha said. Her voice was matter-of-fact, almost casual. "Collins and I never really ended things. We stayed in contact the whole time." Mark felt his hands grip the armrests of the chair. "You were seeing him our entire marriage?" he asked. Natasha shrugged. Yeah, so what? You weren't what I needed. The devastating revelations came one after another. Natasha didn't hold back. It was like she'd been waiting for this moment, waiting to finally tell Mark exactly what she thought of him. I needed a place to stay and you were available, she said. Collins was broke when I left him. He couldn't afford anything. But you had a house and a steady job. You were useful. Mark felt something inside him cracking. So I was what? A placeholder? Natasha nodded. Basically, you were supposed to be temporary until Collins got his life together. And now he has. So I don't need you anymore. Mark asked the question he'd been dreading. When you told me to get muscular like him, you were already sleeping with him? Natasha smiled. Actually smiled. Yeah, I was trying to make you better, but you failed. You turned yourself into a freak instead. Mark felt rage building, but he kept his voice steady. You watched me destroy my body while you were with him? Natasha leaned back on the couch, completely relaxed, completely unbothered. I never forced you to inject anything. That's on you. You did that to yourself. I just made a suggestion, and you took it too far. Mark stood up and walked to the kitchen, needing to move, needing to do something with the energy building inside him. He pulled out his bank statements and brought them back to the living room. He dropped them on the coffee table in front of Natasha. I spent $47,000 on you in 6 months, Mark said. I have $347 left in my account. I have nothing. You took everything. Natasha glanced at the bank statements and shrugged again. That was your choice. I didn't ask you to do that. You wanted to play stepdad to my kids. You wanted to be the hero. That's not my problem. The final insult came next. Natasha checked her phone and stood up. Look, I'm not on your level anymore. Collins is picking me up in 20 minutes. We're going out. He's more of a man than you'll ever be. She started gathering the divorce papers. Just sign these and we can both move on with our lives. Move on with your fake body and your victim complex. Something inside Mark snapped. Years of emasculation collided with months of financial exploitation. The daily humiliation mixed with the discovery of betrayal. Mark had no savings left. He had no future left. He had no dignity left. Everything he'd sacrificed, everything he'd endured, everything he'd destroyed about himself, it was all for nothing. Natasha had used him completely and was now walking away to be with the man she'd been cheating with the entire time. Natasha stood up and started walking toward the door. I'm done here, she said. She didn't even look back at Mark. She just headed for the exit like this was any other business meeting, like she hadn't just admitted to destroying a man's entire life. Mark stood up. You're not leaving, he said. His voice was different now. Flat. Empty. Natasha stopped and turned around. Don't tell me what to do. You're pathetic. You've always been pathetic. That's why I never loved you. Those were the last words Natasha Peters would ever speak. Mark walked to the bedroom. He opened his closet. He reached up to the top shelf where he kept a lockbox. Inside was a gun he'd purchased legally 2 years before the marriage for home protection. He'd never fired it except at a shooting range once. He loaded the magazine. He walked back to the living room. Natasha was standing by the door, phone in hand, probably texting Collins that she'd be ready soon. She looked up and saw Mark holding the gun. Her face changed. The smugness disappeared. Fear replaced it. What are you doing? She asked. Mark didn't answer. He didn't warn her. He didn't threaten her. He just raised the gun and fired. The first shot hit Natasha in the chest. She stumbled backward, hit the wall, started to fall. Mark kept firing. 13 shots total. Each one fired within approximately 8 seconds. The sound was deafening in the small living room. Smoke filled the air. Shell casings scattered across the floor. By the time Mark stopped pulling the trigger, Natasha was on the ground, motionless. After Mark fired the last shot, he stood in the living room holding the empty gun. Smoke hung in the air. The smell of gunpowder was overwhelming. Natasha's body was on the floor near the door, motionless, blood pooling around her. Mark lowered the gun and walked to the couch. He sat down. The gun dropped to the floor beside him. And then he just stared. For 47 minutes, Mark sat on that couch and stared at what he'd done. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. He didn't try to help her. He just sat there in complete silence, watching Natasha's body, processing the fact that he'd just killed his wife. Mark didn't call the police immediately. He didn't flee the scene or try to run. He just sat there, frozen, his mind trying to catch up with what his body had just done. But then something unexpected happened. Something shifted in Mark's demeanor. The shock began to fade and was replaced by something else. A cold, clear awareness of his situation. Mark realized he'd just committed murder. He realized police would come. He realized he would go to prison for the rest of his life unless he did something to protect himself. Mark's brain switched from emotional shutdown to survival mode. He stood up from the couch and started looking around the room. He began staging the scene. Mark moved furniture slightly to make it look like there had been a struggle. He pushed the coffee table to the side, knocked over a lamp, scattered some papers across the floor. He wanted police to think someone had been fighting, that there had been chaos before the shooting. Mark went to his bedroom and grabbed one of his shirts from the closet. He came back to the living room and tore the shirt deliberately, creating rips and tears that looked like someone had grabbed it violently. He placed the torn shirt on the floor near Natasha's body, positioning it carefully so it would look like it had been pulled off during a fight. Mark looked down at his arms and realized he needed visible injuries. He used his fingernails to create scratch marks on his forearms and neck. He pressed hard, breaking the skin in some places, making sure the marks would be obvious when police arrived. Mark went to the bathroom and looked at the scratches in the mirror. They looked real enough, but he needed more. He needed blood. Mark took a small knife from the kitchen drawer and made a shallow cut on his palm. Not deep enough to need stitches, but deep enough to bleed. He let the blood drip onto the carpet in the living room, creating the appearance that he'd been injured during a struggle. He smeared some of the blood on his clothes. He made sure it looked authentic, like he'd been fighting for his life. Mark walked back to Natasha's body and positioned her hand near a kitchen knife that he'd placed on the floor. He wanted police to think the intruder had brought a weapon, that there had been a confrontation involving the knife before the shooting. He wiped the knife handle clean to remove any fingerprints and then placed it carefully. Mark stood back and looked at the scene he'd created. It looked like a home invasion. It looked like someone had broken in, fought with both Mark and Natasha, and then shot her before fleeing. Mark rehearsed his story mentally, going over every detail, making sure he could tell it convincingly. He practiced his tone of voice, his emotional reactions, his body language. He needed to sound terrified, traumatized, desperate. He needed police to believe him. Mark checked the time. It was 9:47 p.m. He took a deep breath and called 911. When the dispatcher answered, Mark's voice was completely different from the calm tone he'd had earlier. He sounded panicked, crying, desperate, a complete transformation from the cold calculation he'd just displayed. "Someone broke in!" Mark shouted into the phone. His voice was shaking. "My wife. She's been shot. Please help, she's bleeding." The dispatcher tried to calm him down. "Sir, I need you to stay calm. Where are you right now?" Mark's response came out in broken sobs. "I'm at my house. Someone broke in through the back door. I tried to fight him off, but he had a gun. He shot her. He ran out the back door." The dispatcher asked if Mark was injured. Mark responded exactly as he'd planned. "He hit me. I'm bleeding. Please send someone now. My wife isn't moving. There's so much blood." The dispatcher assured Mark that police and paramedics were on the way. She told him to stay on the line. Mark kept crying, kept playing the role of the terrified husband who just witnessed his wife's murder. Police arrived within 6 minutes. When they pulled up to the house, Mark was outside on the front lawn. He was crying. His hands were shaking. His clothes were covered in blood. He looked like someone who'd just been through a traumatic experience. Officers approached him carefully, assessing the situation. One officer asked Mark what happened. Mark's story came out in fragments, exactly as he'd rehearsed. Someone broke in, through the back. He wanted money or jewelry. Natasha screamed. He shot her. I tried to stop him. He hit me. Then he ran. Officers asked Mark to describe the intruder. Mark gave them a description he'd prepared. Black male, medium build, wearing a dark hoodie, couldn't see his face. 2 officers entered the house while others stayed outside with Mark. They found Natasha's body in the living room, exactly where Mark had left her. The officers inside the house immediately began assessing the scene. They saw the overturned furniture, the scattered papers, the torn shirt near the body, the kitchen knife on the floor. It looked like a struggle had taken place. But something felt wrong to the experienced officers. They checked the back door that Mark claimed the intruder used to enter and exit. The door was still locked from the inside. There was no forced entry anywhere in the house. No broken windows, no jimmied locks, nothing. If someone had broken in, how did they get inside? And how did they lock the door from the inside when they left? The officers looked at Mark's injuries. The scratches on his arms and neck, the cut on his palm. They were superficial. They didn't look like injuries from a life-or-death struggle with an armed intruder. They looked staged. Police administered a gunshot residue test to Mark right there on the front lawn. The test came back positive. Mark's hands had gunshot residue on them. When officers confronted him with this, Mark had his explanation ready. "I tried to grab the gun from him during the struggle," Mark said. "I got my hands on it for a second, but he was stronger. That must be why there's residue." But the officers weren't convinced. They counted 13 shell casings on the living room floor. The magazine in the gun was nearly empty. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was an execution. Someone had stood in one position and fired 13 times. Mark kept insisting he didn't do it. "I didn't kill my wife. Why would I kill her? Someone broke in and did this. You're wasting time. He's getting away." But detectives were already finding evidence that contradicted Mark's story. Detectives found Mark's phone on the kitchen counter. They looked through it and found the photos of Natasha and Collins together. They found the motel receipts. They found text messages between Mark and Natasha discussing the divorce. They saw the divorce papers spread out on the coffee table. They checked Mark's bank statements and saw the financial devastation. Detectives put the pieces together quickly. This wasn't a random home invasion. This was a domestic murder. Mark had a clear motive. His wife was leaving him after draining his finances and cheating on him throughout their marriage. Mark was arrested on suspicion of murder. As officers handcuffed him, Mark continued his performance. He cried. He begged them to believe him. "You're making a mistake. Someone killed my wife and you're arresting me. This is wrong." But police had seen enough staged crime scenes to recognize one when they saw it. As the investigation into Natasha's murder progressed, Mark's defense attorney introduced an alternative theory. Could Collins Jenkins have been involved in the killing? The attorney pointed out that Collins had motive, opportunity, and a relationship with the victim. Collins was having an affair with Natasha while she was married to Mark. Collins wanted Natasha, completely to himself. What if Collins decided to eliminate Mark from the equation by killing Natasha and framing Mark for it? What if the entire scene was set up not by Mark, but by someone else who wanted Mark to take the fall? The theory sounded plausible on the surface. Police decided to investigate Collins thoroughly, to either rule him out or confirm his involvement. Detectives examined the timeline of events on the night of the murder. According to Mark's 911 call, Natasha was shot around 9:30 p.m. According to Natasha's text messages with Collins earlier that day, Collins was supposed to pick Natasha up at 9 p.m. They had plans to go out together, but Natasha never showed up and never answered Collins's calls. Police brought Collins in for questioning. He arrived at the station voluntarily, cooperating fully with the investigation. Collins sat across from detectives and told them his version of events. "I was at home waiting for Natasha. She was supposed to come over, but she never showed up. I called her a few times, but she didn't answer. I figured maybe she changed her mind, or had to deal with something involving her ex-husband." Detectives asked Collins if he had any witnesses who could confirm his whereabouts. Collins shook his head. "No, I was alone. I live by myself." The lack of an alibi made Collins a person of interest. Detectives looked at his phone records to verify his story. The records showed Collins had called Natasha at 9:15 p.m. with no answer. He called again at 9:25 p.m., still no answer. At 9:32 p.m., Collins sent a text message that read, "Where are you? I'm waiting." The text was never read by Natasha because by that time, she was already dead. Detectives considered a new theory. What if Collins went to Mark's house when Natasha didn't answer? What if Collins arrived, saw Natasha and Mark talking, and in a fit of jealous rage, shot Natasha? What if Mark witnessed the murder, but created a false story to protect himself, knowing he couldn't prove Collins did it? The theory had some logic to it. Collins had strong feelings for Natasha. He'd been having an affair with her for months. Maybe he couldn't handle the idea of losing her. Police administered a gunshot residue test to Collins. The test came back negative. There was no residue on his hands, but detectives noted that Collins could have washed his hands thoroughly or changed his clothes after the shooting. The absence of residue didn't definitively prove innocence. Detectives obtained a search warrant for Collins' home and vehicle. They executed the warrant the following day, looking for any evidence that might connect him to the crime. They searched for the murder weapon, a handgun that matched the caliber used to kill Natasha. They found nothing. They looked for evidence of recent gun cleaning, bloody clothing, anything that would indicate Collins had been involved in a shooting. Again, nothing. Collins' vehicle was examined thoroughly. No evidence of travel to Mark's neighborhood. No blood, no shell casings, no weapons. Detectives reviewed traffic camera footage from the area around Mark's house. They tracked Collins' vehicle throughout the evening. The footage showed Collins' car never left his apartment complex area. His car remained parked in his designated spot from 6:45 p.m. when he arrived home from work until after midnight. If Collins had driven to Mark's house to kill Natasha, his vehicle would have been captured on at least one of the traffic cameras along the route. But there was no such footage. Detectives interviewed Collins' neighbor, an older woman who lived in the apartment next door. She confirmed seeing Collins arrive home from work around 6:45 p.m. She said she never saw him leave again that evening. She mentioned hearing his TV playing through the wall, which was common. The Collins theory was falling apart under scrutiny. Police refocused their investigation entirely on Mark. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Mark's phone records and internet search history. What they found was damning. Weeks before the murder, Mark had been searching online for specific information. How to stage a home invasion. Can police tell who shot a gun? How long does gunshot residue stay on hands? The searches proved that Mark had been planning to stage the crime scene long before the murder actually happened. This wasn't a crime of passion where Mark snapped in the moment. This was premeditated. Mark had researched how to make it look like someone else killed Natasha. He'd studied how to avoid getting caught. The stage scene wasn't improvised. It was carefully planned. Detectives also discovered that Mark had been tracking Natasha's location for weeks using a phone app. He'd been monitoring where she went, who she met, how long she stayed. Mark knew about the affair long before the confrontation. The anonymous tip about Natasha and Collins being together? That was fabricated. Mark had discovered the affair on his own through spying and surveillance. He'd collected evidence, photos, phone records, receipts, and used them to confront Natasha on the night he killed her. The entire narrative Mark tried to sell to police was a lie. There was no anonymous tipster. There was no home invader. There was just Mark, planning revenge against a wife who'd betrayed him. Forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed more inconsistencies with Mark's story. Blood spatter experts examined the patterns on the walls and floor. Natasha had been shot while moving toward the door, not during a struggle with an intruder. The angle and trajectory of the bullets proved the shooter had been standing in one fixed position, firing repeatedly at a moving target. There was no evidence of any struggle between the shooter and the victim. The shell casings on the floor created a pattern that showed the shooter never moved. They stayed in the same spot and emptied the magazine. Mark's superficial injuries were examined by a medical examiner who confirmed they were self-inflicted. The scratches were too uniform, too shallow, and showed marks consistent with fingernails, not defensive wounds from a fight. The kitchen knife near Natasha's body had no fingerprints at all. It had been wiped clean and then placed, exactly as Mark had done. Before moving on, a quick thank you to everyone watching and supporting this channel. Your presence truly keeps it alive. This community continues to grow because of people who believe in real, meaningful storytelling. Becoming a channel member unlocks exclusive extras, behind-the-scenes content, and directly helps us bring more powerful true stories to light. Your support makes a real difference, and we'd love to know who's here. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. If you're still tuned in right now, write "I'm still here" in the comments. Let's see who's watching till the end. Don't forget to like this video too. Now, let's continue. Confronted with overwhelming evidence, Mark's facade finally crumbled. Detectives brought him into an interrogation room and laid out everything they'd found. The internet searches, the phone tracking, the forensic evidence, the staged injuries, the impossible timeline of his intruder story. Mark sat across the table from two detectives, handcuffed, exhausted, and trapped. For the first 2 hours of questioning, Mark stuck to his story. He insisted an intruder had broken in and killed Natasha. But the detectives didn't believe him, and they made that clear. They showed him printouts of his internet searches. They showed him the forensic reports. They explained how they knew he was lying. After 4 hours of interrogation, Mark finally broke. He put his head in his hands and said the words detectives had been waiting to hear. "I did it. I killed her. There was no intruder." Mark's confession came pouring out. He explained everything. The comparisons Natasha made to Collins, the ADE injections he used to try to change his body, the discovery of the affair, the financial devastation, the final confrontation. Mark told detectives about the months of psychological abuse he'd endured. He described how Natasha had torn him down every single day, making him feel worthless and inadequate. He explained how he'd spent $47,000 supporting her and her children, leaving himself with nothing. He admitted to planning the meeting with Natasha, knowing it could end violently. "She destroyed me and laughed about it," Mark said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "I snapped when she said Collins was picking her up, when she told me he was more of a man than I'd ever be. That's when I stopped thinking and just acted." Mark admitted to staging the scene after the shooting. He explained how he'd moved furniture, torn his shirt, created scratch marks on his body, and positioned the knife near Natasha's corpse. "I didn't want to go to prison," Mark said. "I thought I could make it look like a robbery. I thought if I called 911 and acted traumatized, police would believe me." Detectives asked why he confessed if he'd gone through so much trouble to cover it up. Mark's response was telling. "Because I knew I couldn't live with myself if I got away with it. Part of me wanted to be caught. Part of me wanted to tell someone what she did to me. I wanted people to know the truth about Natasha." Mark's psychological state during the confession was a complete emotional collapse. He wasn't crying. He wasn't begging for mercy. He was just numb, defeated, empty. Detectives asked Mark if he felt any regret for killing Natasha. His answer shocked them. "I don't regret pulling the trigger. She deserved what happened. She used me and threw me away like I was nothing. I spent months trying to be good enough for her. I destroyed my body for her. I gave her everything I had, and she was sleeping with her ex the entire time." Mark's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he was explaining a simple transaction. "She made me feel like I was worthless. She told me every day that I wasn't a real man. She compared me to Collins constantly. She watched me inject myself with that veterinary drug and didn't care that I was hurting myself. She only cared that I didn't look the way she wanted me to look." Detectives pushed back, asking if Mark understood that abuse didn't justify murder. Mark responded, "I know what I did was wrong, legally, but emotionally, I don't feel guilty. She broke me first." Police asked Mark about Natasha's 3 children. What did he think about the fact that they'd lost their mother? Mark's response was cold. "They're Collins' kids. He can take care of them now. They never liked me anyway. Natasha made sure of that. She encouraged them to mock me, to treat me like a joke. Those kids saw me as a freak, not as their stepfather. I have nothing to feel guilty about regarding them." Detectives found this particularly disturbing. Mark showed no remorse for the impact his actions would have on 3 innocent children. He'd compartmentalized his rage so thoroughly that he could only see Natasha as his tormentor. Everyone else was irrelevant. Mark revealed one more detail that made the premeditation clear. He'd loaded the gun before Natasha arrived. He'd placed it in his bedroom closet within easy reach. He'd requested the meeting knowing it could end in violence. "I wanted answers," Mark admitted. "And if she didn't give me what I needed to hear, I was ready to do something drastic. Part of me hoped she'd apologize. Part of me hoped she'd show some remorse for what she'd done to me. But I knew she wouldn't. Natasha wasn't capable of empathy. When she told me Collins was picking her up, when she called me pathetic, I just stopped thinking. My hand moved on its own. I got the gun, came back, and started firing. I didn't count the shots. I just kept pulling the trigger until the magazine was empty." Mark was formally charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution argued that premeditation was evident through the internet searches, the staged crime scene, and the loaded gun. Mark's defense attorney argued for diminished capacity, claiming psychological abuse had impaired Mark's judgment. The attorney framed it as a crime of passion despite the planning elements. Mark ultimately pled guilty to second-degree murder to avoid a trial. His sentencing hearing focused on mitigation, whether the psychological abuse he'd suffered should reduce his sentence. Mark made a statement to the court. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I know what I did was wrong. I took a life. I ended someone's existence. But I want people to understand what Natasha did to me first. She used me, abused me, humiliated me, and destroyed me financially and psychologically. None of that excuses murder, but it explains how I got to that point." The judge responded with a statement that captured the complexity of the case. Psychological abuse is real and its effects are devastating. But murder is not the answer. Taking another person's life is never justified, no matter how much pain you've endured. Mark was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He would be eligible for parole in 20 years. Natasha's 3 children were 7, 9, and 11 years old when their mother was murdered. Custody was immediately awarded to their biological father, Collins Jenkins. The children had been at Collins's mother's house on the night of the murder, spared from witnessing the horror that unfolded. But they weren't spared from the aftermath. When Collins told them what happened, their reactions were exactly what you'd expect: shock, confusion, overwhelming grief. They'd lost their mother in the most violent way possible. For the first few weeks, the children were devastated. They couldn't process what had happened. They couldn't understand why Mark would do this. They asked questions Collins didn't know how to answer. But as more details about the case emerged publicly, the children's feelings became more complicated. All 3 children were in ongoing therapy, trying to work through the trauma of losing their mother. Psychologists reported that the children harbored significant guilt for their role in mocking Mark at Natasha's urging. The middle child, a 9-year-old boy, struggled with nightmares. He would wake up screaming, convinced that he'd caused the murder by calling Mark "monster arms" and laughing at him. "Did we make him do it?" the boy asked his therapist. "If we hadn't been mean to him, would he have killed Mom?" The therapist tried to explain that Mark's actions were his own responsibility, that the children weren't to blame. But guilt doesn't respond to logic, especially in a child's mind. The youngest child, a 7-year-old girl, was too young to fully comprehend the complexity of what had happened. She knew her mother was gone. She knew Mark had killed her. But she also remembered that her mother had been mean to Mark. The contradictions were impossible for her young mind to reconcile. Collins struggled with raising 3 children alone. Despite his increased income of $4,800 a month, the financial strain of supporting 3 kids was significant. He had to pay for therapy, school expenses, clothes, food, and everything else children need. But the financial burden was nothing compared to the emotional weight. Collins carried tremendous guilt. He knew his affair with Natasha had contributed to her death. If he hadn't reconnected with her, if he hadn't encouraged her betrayal of Mark, maybe she'd still be alive. Collins made a statement to a social worker assigned to check on the children's well-being. "I never thought it would end like this. Natasha wasn't perfect. She made mistakes, but those kids needed their mother, and I played a role in why she's gone." The children asked Collins difficult questions he didn't want to answer. Why did Mark kill Mommy? Was mommy mean to him? Did you and mommy do something wrong? Collins tried to protect them from the full truth. He gave them age-appropriate answers that shielded them from the worst details. But the eldest child wasn't satisfied with incomplete answers. She researched the case thoroughly online, reading court documents and news reports. She learned everything: the affair timeline, the manipulation, the financial exploitation, all of it. When she confronted Collins with what she'd learned, he had no choice but to confirm it. The family dynamics were forever altered. Collins never remarried. He focused entirely on raising his children and trying to give them some semblance of stability. But the damage was done. The children's relationship with Collins became complicated once they understood the full story. The eldest child told her therapist, "Dad was cheating with Mom while she was married to Mark. That's wrong. Everyone says cheating is wrong. So why did my dad do it?" Trust issues developed in all three children. If their parents could lie, cheat, and manipulate, who could they trust? School counselors reported behavioral problems in all three kids. The eldest became withdrawn and isolated, struggling to maintain friendships. The middle child developed anger issues, getting into fights with classmates. The youngest became anxious and clingy, terrified of being separated from Collins. The long-term impact on the children's mental health was severe. Therapists predicted ongoing issues with trust, relationships, and emotional regulation well into adulthood. These three children were the unintended victims of Natasha and Mark's toxic relationship, innocent casualties of decisions made by adults who never considered the consequences. Public reaction to the case was deeply divided. Some people viewed Mark as a victim who'd been pushed too far. Online comments reflected this perspective. She abused him for months. She destroyed his body and his finances. She cheated on him. From day one. I'm not saying murder is right, but I understand why he snapped. Others viewed Mark as a cold-blooded killer who deserved no sympathy. Abuse doesn't justify murder, period. He could have divorced her, walked away, moved on with his life. Instead, he chose to kill her. That makes him a murderer, not a victim. The complexity of the case made both perspectives feel partially true. Mark was abused, Natasha was cruel, but murder was still murder. No amount of psychological torment justified taking a life. Psychological experts weighed in on the case, using it as an example of invisible wounds that psychological abuse can create. One expert explained, "This case illustrates how emotional abuse destroys people from the inside. The constant comparisons, the financial exploitation, the humiliation, these create unbearable pressure." Mark Sanderson's mental state deteriorated over months until he reached a breaking point. Another expert discussed coercive control, a term typically associated with female victims of domestic violence. Coercive control applies to male victims too. Society often dismisses male victims of emotional abuse, assuming men can't be psychologically destroyed by women. But this case proves otherwise. Mark was systematically broken down until he couldn't function rationally anymore. But experts were careful to make a critical distinction. Abuse explains Mark's psychological state. It doesn't excuse his choice to commit murder. Understanding why someone snaps doesn't mean condoning their actions. Legal experts analyzed the verdict and sentence. The second-degree murder conviction was appropriate. Premeditation was evident, but the psychological abuse created enough reasonable doubt about first-degree murder. 25 years to life is a fair sentence given the circumstances. Another legal analyst noted, "The conversation about male victims of emotional abuse is important, but we can't let that conversation diminish the seriousness of murder. Mark Sanderson killed his wife in cold blood. He fired 13 shots. That's not a momentary loss of control. That's sustained violence." The sentence reflects that reality. Domestic violence advocates use the case to highlight gender neutrality in abuse. Gender doesn't matter. Abuse is abuse. Men can be victims just as women can be perpetrators. Society needs to recognize this and provide support for all victims, regardless of gender. The questions that linger from this case force uncomfortable conversations. Where's the line between accountability and compassion? Mark was abused, but he committed murder. Should we feel sympathy for him or condemnation? Can psychological torture create a murderer? The evidence suggests yes. Constant abuse can push someone past their breaking point. But does that reduce their responsibility for their actions? How much abuse can a person endure before breaking? The answer varies by individual, but Mark's case shows that everyone has limits. Who bears responsibility when someone snaps? Mark pulled the trigger, but Natasha created the conditions that led to violence. Is she partially responsible for her own death? These questions have no easy answers. They sit in moral gray areas where most people prefer not to dwell. One question particularly divided public opinion. Was Natasha's behavior criminal, even if not legally prosecutable? Emotional abuse isn't illegal in most jurisdictions. Financial exploitation within marriage is difficult to prosecute. But Natasha's actions destroyed Mark's mental health, physical appearance, and financial stability. Should there be legal consequences for psychological abuse even when no physical violence occurs? Another question. Should psychological abuse be a mitigating factor in murder sentencing? Mark received 25 years to life. If he'd killed Natasha without the abuse history, he likely would have received life without parole. Did the abuse justify a reduced sentence? Or does allowing abuse as mitigation create a dangerous precedent? The ADE injections became a symbol of Mark's desperation. Following the case, the FDA issued warnings about veterinary product abuse. Online forums that promoted dangerous body modification practices were shut down. Educational campaigns launched to inform people about the risks of non-approved substances. Mark's disfigured appearance in court photos served as a powerful deterrent. Medical professionals used his case to warn patients about the dangers of seeking shortcuts to physical transformation. The message was clear. Desperation leads to dangerous decisions. Mark's body became a permanent reminder of what happens when psychological abuse drives someone to self-destruction. Mark Sanderson currently sits in prison, classified as a model inmate with no disciplinary issues. Medical treatment for the ADE damage is ongoing. State-provided surgery has reduced some of the disfigurement, but Mark's body will never be normal. Psychological evaluations show Mark remains convinced that Natasha shares responsibility for what happened. He's remorseful about the murder itself. He acknowledges killing was wrong. But he believes Natasha's abuse created the circumstances that made violence inevitable. Mark wrote one letter to Natasha's children. The letter said, "I can't undo what I did. I can't bring your mother back. I'm sorry you lost her. I hope someday you understand that people do terrible things when they're broken beyond repair." The children never responded. Mark is eligible for parole in 2044 when he'll be 52 years old. The parole board will consider his psychological abuse history, his remorse, and his rehabilitation. The likelihood of parole remains uncertain. The cost of this tragedy is staggering. Natasha died at 29 years old. Mark will spend decades in prison. 3 children were traumatized. Collins lives with guilt. There are no winners in this story. Only destruction. Warning. Signs were ignored at every stage. Mark's friends warned him not to marry Natasha. Natasha's constant comparisons should have been a relationship red flag. Mark's desperate body modification was a cry for help that no one answered. Financial exploitation was a clear pattern that went unaddressed. All signs pointed to a toxic relationship spiraling toward disaster. But no one intervened. No one forced Mark to walk away. No one confronted Natasha about her abuse. The tragedy was preventable at multiple points. But pride, desperation, and cruelty created a perfect storm. When that storm hit, only destruction remained. If this case made you think, made you feel something, made you question where the line is drawn between victim and perpetrator, share this video. These conversations matter. The stories we ignore are the ones that repeat themselves. Don't let this become just another true crime case you watched and forgot. Let it be a reminder to recognize abuse in all its forms, to help people before they reach their breaking point, and to understand that every action has consequences. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into cases that challenge everything we think we know about crime, justice, and the human condition. Hit that notification bell, because the next case might be the one that changes your perspective entirely. If you or someone you know is experiencing psychological abuse, male or female, reach out. Talk to someone. Get help, because the alternative isn't worth it. The path Mark took destroyed everyone involved. Don't let desperation lead you down that same road. Remember, everyone has a breaking point. The question isn't whether it exists, it's what we do before we reach it. Do we walk away? Do we seek help? Do we make choices that protect ourselves and others? Or do we stay until something breaks that can never be fixed? Mark chose wrong. Natasha chose wrong. Their children paid the price. Don't let that be your story. Thanks for watching.